And so today is kind of an overview of social justice, going to zero in on one particular component, and I'm confident we're going to carry that out into next week. So today, to start with, and again, I'm going to apologize in advance because Christianity and the United States of America are not equal, but I think there's some things about the United States of America that we can learn in our study of the biblical justice. So living in the United States of America today, we are particularly blessed to live in a nation in which the founders understood these biblical principles that we just described. It's very clear. Help me out. The individual, he's got a foundation that has the largest private collection of original documents. In his book, Original Intent, I can see the look of, what's the name? I can't think of the name. Did have an opportunity to hear him speak. But if you read the book, Original Intent, it pretty much dismisses all of the history revisionists out there who want to describe our founders as something quite different. But Original Intent made it very clear. These guys knew and understood the biblical concept, even though several were simply deists and not necessarily Christians. They still understood the biblical concept of government. And they understood this concept of biblical justice alongside the sinfulness of man, which is why, and then I apologize, this is a little bit of a civics lesson, but you'll see how it all ties together later on. They clearly understood this concept, which is why that we have the three branches. We've got the legislative branch. And the job of the legislative branch is to make laws. And in making laws, as well as manage the checkbook, so you got the legislative branch, and the legislative branch is what's known as bicameral. Okay, so you've got the House and you've got the Senate. I mean, really, humanly speaking, this is brilliant how this was put together. And then you've got the executive branch that carries out the day-to-day functions of government, that takes these laws and puts them into practice. And then you've got the judicial branch. And the judicial branch is the ones that says, oh, you know that law that you made? That is not legal. It does not conform to the Constitution. So those were the three branches that were put together. It's interesting here, and people sometimes forget this, that we are the United States of America. So a state was not necessarily, or was not a, here's federal, here's state, here's county, here's local, just different levels of government. It was a group of states that came together to say, let's form a nation. And on the one side, there were people that said, but, we need to be democratically ruled. And so all the votes and the people and everything, and that considered population centers. So the concern was that there were some states that would have greater authority than other states. And so the Senate came about, where there was equal representation among the states. So that's basic civics lesson. Young people, have you ever heard any of that before? Okay, good, because there's a whole, Isaac's got it. All right, so because there's a whole slew of students that have no clue what I just described as what was put together. So all of these things, all of these branches they fall under this umbrella called the Constitution. So there are rules for making laws here and everything else, but the Constitution was the line in the sand. So you shall not cross this line in the sand. And then this Constitution, and then if you go even further back, all of which are under this other umbrella, a much broader umbrella right here, and we'll just call these the self-evident truths. In other words, these truths that we are endowed by the Creator, that's part of our founding documents, endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. So that's how it all ties together in the brilliance. Truth and justice, and this is the important part of this little exercise here, is to point out that when we were established as a nation, truth and justice, this twin pillars of truth and justice that's holding up this house right here, the twin pillars of truth and justice, that these truth and justice transcends man. As opposed to created by man. So this was the understanding, and that's what was meant by, we see these self-evident truths that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. The founders understood this. And this is a key part where truth and justice in this whole system transcends man. Therein lies the fundamental difference. There was two major events going on. The fundamental difference between the American War for Independence, and I think David went through this last week a little bit, in which there was an established government that told another established government, we are shaking the bonds off. This is not fair, this is not right, this is not good, this is even oppressing. We're shaking it off. But this came from a government to a government. So the difference between the American War for Independence and the French Revolution. The French Revolution was guided more so not by that which transcends man, but that which is man-made. Basically, it was substituting one power for another power. It was shaking off the bourgeois, basically. Those individuals identified as the elite, saying, okay, we're done with you, we're shaking you off, and of course that worked really well. Introduce Madame Guillotine. So again, it substitutes one man-made power for another man-made power. So remember that part. One understood that government was established by God. Okay, I went through all that, sorry. One acknowledged that rule of law transcended mankind. The other believed the rule of law comes from mankind. And that brings us to today, the current social justice movement. So now what we do is we move on to a movement that really has always lurked in our nation, has always been there, and has just very slowly moved forward. Only today it has come out and is steamrolling in full force, and something that demands, it's a movement that demands our full and unquestionable obedience. But as followers of Jesus Christ, as with everything, anything that comes out or anything that's done, we have to hold it up to the light of the Bible and say, what does this really mean? And at the heart of all of this is we're going to get to this, and we're going to get to this. That Constitution, by the way, was made very difficult to amend. So the Constitution, there was a way of amending it, but it wasn't just a snap process. It was, you got to go through the legislative process, then you got to send it back out to the states for ratification, because after all, we are the United States of America, before it can finally get ratified. But then there's a movement over the year that says, well, the Constitution really, it was made in the 1700s. It really doesn't apply to us today. So what we really need to do is we need to interpret the Constitution as a living, breathing document to match today's time. And by that statement, that license is then given to make it say whatever you think it should say for the time. Does that sound familiar at all in terms of the church? Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? The Bible was written at a time when, people were ignorant and, there was a bunch of mythologies and all of this stuff. And so today, the Bible just, you can't really interpret it unless you see it through the lens of today's period. Is that what the Bible says of itself? No. So there's some similarities there. And by the way, everything that we're talking about did not happen and is not happening independent of the church. The church is right alongside all of this that's going on. So that slow transition that we're talking about has now accelerated to light speed, and we are watching a transformational movement right before our eyes. And the centerpiece of this movement is social justice. In social justice, and there's typically three things that are in there. And this is the interesting thing about movements, because the words in of themselves, I have a heart for it. I have a heart for some of these things. I mean, that's the business that I'm in. I try to help with some of these things. But then taken to, but in reality are taken to mean something quite else. Did I say that right? Is not really as it appears. Look for the man behind the curtain, basically. So in this one, there are three things. The calls that fall under this have to do with sexual liberty. That's what Albert Mohler calls the newfound amendment in the Constitution that's not really written there, but is there now. Sexual liberty. The other part has to do with economic equity. Economic equity, which again, by itself, sounds okay. And then the third part is racial equality, which that too is something that is right and good and should be pursued. So that brings us to defining it. What is social justice? Now I'm going to ask you to bear with me a little bit, because I'm not going to launch full head-on steam into it. I'm just going to introduce a definition of social justice, and then we're going to go right into biblical justice before we come back and apply it to social justice. So in terms of websites that are sympathetic to social justice as it applies today, I'm just, again, you know the drill. That's what I've done with every topic, is gone to the source and say, what do they say of themselves? And so this one, I'm just going to take a first part here, and I have to do this. social justice, according to the movement, is a concept of fair and just relations between the individual and society. This definition has not always been the definition of social justice. It's not new. It's something that's been with us since the 1800s. It came out of actually the priesthood in the Roman Catholic Church. So the concept of social justice, doing what's right in society, defending the poor, the widow, the fatherless, those things, applying biblical justice. So those things came out of that. But again, as is many things, it's something that changed over time. But this is what they say. So the concept of fair and just relations between the individual and society, and if you go further, they say that it's measured by the distribution of wealth, opportunities for personal activity, and social privileges. Those three things, which you see right up here. So, with that as an introduction as far as the definition, and then we'll come back and we'll examine this in a lot more detail. But let's stop, as we did with the $100 bill, let's stop and examine just what is biblical justice and what does that look like. So I'm going to erase this so that we can identify the counterfeit after we look at what the real thing looks like. All right, biblical justice. So just a word about word studies. So when I do a word study, I'll tell you right now, I am not professing to be the expert in Hebrew or Greek. So you need to make that clear. But I do have my concordance, and I do have the Kittle's dictionary, and able to look things up. And Kittle, I know you've got to be familiar with Kittle's dictionary. Kittle's dictionary goes through a very thorough review of the word, and not just what it means, but how it was used in the Old Testament times, how it was used in contemporary periods of the time, how it's applied in the New Testament, and so kind of watches the evolution of the word, and so it's really a very good study. So if you do not own Kittle's Greek dictionary, I encourage you. That's a wonderful, wonderful tool. So I will tell you that when you see the word justice and judgment, when you do the word study, so justice and judgment, they're the same word. So they're the same word that's used, and so in the English translation, this is used interchangeably. So between justice and judgment. If you go to the English, and again, we go through the Webster's and looking at that, justice is the administration of law. It's the administration of law. It's applying the law to certain situations and saying this is what the law says. And so the biblical use of justice then takes that administration of law, and this is how Kittle describes it. He describes it as the organic, or describes it as spelling better, organic act between, organic act? No, that's not right. Between act and consequence. I don't think that word's right. I think it should be relationship. It's the organic relationship between act and consequence. Not a big surprise, because in administering justice, if you do this, then this happens. Okay? If you do this, then this happens. This word study, if you take out and further out and look at the whole thing, one thing that becomes very clear: it demonstrates the seriousness of justice and judgment. The biblical use of these words, this is not a frivolous matter. This is something that is very serious, that God takes very seriously in handling justice. As creator, God established the moral order of being. In other words, this is how you are to live. This is morals. As creator, not only has the right, but he exercised the right as creator to say, this is what is right and wrong. This is what is good and not good. This came from God, and rightly so, as the creator. This moral justice, this moral order is summarized. Where will we find a summary of that moral order? 10 Commandments. Thank you. That is found in the 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments is actually a summary, and then what is it? Matthew 22 is a summary of the summary. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So one thing that we have to stop and notice here right away, the very first thing, and you're going to see this time and again, is that it is God who established the moral order. This did not come from man. This came from God. So God established the moral order. I know for the young people, I hope that's still fresh in your mind, from my class and then from David's class, the time that we spent going through the 10 Commandments and reviewing the 10 Commandments and what is the positive side of the commandment and the negative side of the commandment. For example, the 6th commandment, you shall not murder, is simply not murdering, but there's the positive side of it too, is what are we doing to uplift, uphold, and support our neighbor. So there are two sides to each of those commandments. In fact, let's just stop and do a little exercise. So the caring for the poor, where does that fit in the 10 Commandments, caring for the poor? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Okay. Yep, 8th Commandment. Our Heidelberg Catechism does a remarkable job of this. I'm going to suggest to you that it's both the 8th and the 6th Commandment. So here, I'm sorry? The Great Commandment, summarizes the entire second table of the law. You love your neighbor as yourself. So question and answer 111. So 110 said, what does God forbid in the 8th commandment? Which is, all theft and robbery and unjust weights and so forth. 111, but what does God require of you in this commandment? That I further my neighbor's good, for I can and may deal with him as I would have others deal with me, and labor faithfully so that I may be able to help the poor in their need. That's where you would find it. So helping the poor is a good thing. Sixth commandment. Question 107, but is this all that is required, that we do not kill our neighbor? No, for in condemning envy, hatred, and anger, God requires us, just as you said, to love our neighbor as ourselves, to show patience, peace, meekness, mercy, and kindness toward him, and to prevent his hurt as much as possible. Also, to do good even unto our enemies. So, did you look at my notes? That's good. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yep, but that's exactly right. Yep. Do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. I'm going to give you a little personal glimpse in that I have it 2 places in my office posted. Do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly before God. In all decisions that I find that I have to make. So then there is this moral order established by God. Failure to comply with this moral order results in judgment. Why? Isaiah 30, verse 18. For the Lord is a God of justice. Isaiah 30, verse 18. If you went to Deuteronomy 32, verse 4, he, talking about God, he is the rock. His work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of truth and without injustice. Righteous and upright is he. The foundation for justice is the truth of God's word, in which we receive his law. I like this quote from Ravi Zacharias. Justice is the handmaiden of truth, and when truth dies, justice is buried with it. Very, very well said. God takes justice so seriously. And if you just did the concordance, I don't know if everybody knows about Bible Gateway. It's a great tool. And you just plug in search justice. Bang, 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 bang. Search judgment. I mean, it's going to take you the next 2 hours just to go through all the verses. God takes this so seriously that those who do not obey his law will be judged. There is judgment. And there are 2 judgments. Judgment in this life and then eternal judgment. Judgment in this life, in upholding God's truth, in upholding his law. God's judgment in this life would be referred to as temporal consequences. And so just a quick word about temporal consequences. I was caught speeding, and there was a consequence. When the deputy came to my driver's side and said, "You were speeding," I didn't say, "I'm a child of God. I am forgiven." Oh, yeah, so you can't touch me. Well, no, he can, and he did. He gave me a traffic ticket. And I'm over it, though, really. I was caught speeding, and I paid a traffic fine. A person who steals, and if caught, is subject to jail time and restitution. If the person is not caught, then if the heart is not yet hardened, we'll always look over the shoulder and weave a web of lies trying to cover things up. And sometimes the worst possible temporal judgment is given. Had this conversation recently with someone. The the worst possible. Someone who indicated that, you know, I would do things, but then nothing bad would happen. I think, oh, got away with it, everything. And then, you go through that for a series of time and time again. And that's when I shared. I said, that just scares the dickens out of me. That just scares me. The worst possible temporal judgment is found in Romans 1:24. God gives them over. God gives them up to their own desires. That scares me silly. The idea if God were to give me over to my own desires. So that's temporal judgment. Temporal judgment, and then there is eternal judgment. Yes, hell is real. Eternal judgment is hell. Asaph in Psalm 73 complained. He complained that he saw evildoers who were not being punished. How do these guys get away with it? Come on, Lord, you got to see this. You know this is happening. This is going on. I don't get it. Well, then he was given a glimpse of God's judgment. Psalm 73, verse 17, until I went into the sanctuary of God, then I understood their end. In terms of eternity, this life is a blip on a screen. So eternity should be a great big concern. Is God concerned with justice and judgment? You bet he is. He is very concerned about justice and judgment because he set forth what is the moral order and cannot abide from disobedience. That end, till I understood their end, that end is what Jesus described in Matthew 18 as outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. But here's the deal. God takes judgment or justice so seriously that in order to save his covenant people from eternal hell and instead live with him in eternity, he exercised judgment on his only begotten Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. It doesn't get more serious than that. That's how serious God takes justice. And he exercised that justice not on us, on those who profess his name, but on Jesus Christ, who became a man and subjected himself to the eternal wrath that we deserved. So let's talk about our response to biblical justice. So if God takes judgment according to his law that seriously, you don't have to guess how we're supposed to respond. And back to the point, Micah 6:8, we are likewise to do justly. We are likewise to uphold justice. Proverbs 21, verse 3. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. To do justice is better than showing up at the temple with your sacrifice and going through what the law commanded in offering up your sacrifice. Justice was more important than that. To do justice. God warned against perverting justice. He hated justice being perverted. He still hates. Exodus 23, verse 2. And this is timely. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil. Sounds a little bit like the rioting and looting going on. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil. It's followed then, nor shall you testify in a dispute as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. Deuteronomy 27, verse 9, cursed is the one who perverts the justice due the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And when God says, cursed is the one who does this, we ought to tremble in our boots indeed. And all the people shall say, amen. Psalm 33, verse 5. He loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of the goodness of the Lord. So here we find out, when we look at biblical justice is based on the moral order that was established by God, summarized in the Ten Commandments, found throughout Scripture, that God exercises justice and judgment, and we likewise are called to exercise justice and judgment. Now let's circle back and answer the question, is social justice the same as biblical justice? And interestingly, as we ask this question, there are professing Christians, I personally know some professing Christians, as well as churches that have taken up the call, the contemporary call for social justice, as defined by today's contemporary movement. And what comes back to me is says, after all, does not the Bible say, Psalm 82:3, defend the poor and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and needy? Does not the Bible say in Isaiah 1:17, learn to do good, seek justice, rebuke the oppressor, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow? Well, yeah, the Bible does indeed say those things. And we ought to indeed do those things. But let's take a closer look now back at the goals of social justice. Okay, we're going to put that definition back up there. So in that definition, again, sorry, I don't have this committed to memory. Social justice is the concept of fair and just relations between the individual did I get that? Individual and society. Thank you. And society. So first thing that we're going to take a look at is this whole thing. Fair and just relations between individual and society. I'm going to ask you, is there anything inherently wrong with that statement? Can anybody identify what's wrong with that statement? I'm sorry? Okay. All right. Yeah. Fair and just. Okay. That's what I want to zero in on. Who are the parties in this relationship? The parties in this relationship, according to the Bible, who should be the parties in a fair and just relationship? Yeah, okay, that's exactly right. So this only tells half the story. The full story is that relationship should be between individual and God, as well as individual and society. But as we say this, we understand it in terms of biblical justice. We understand it as the two tables of the law. Love God, love our neighbor. By the way, again, looking at the young people from my class, loving our neighbor. Who's our neighbor? Yeah, Esther, you got it. Everybody. Yeah, our fellow man. Everybody. Okay? And then the next thing, I'm going to circle back to what was said before, I think it was said here, and who sets the standards for fairness and justice? What is fair and just? And what are those standards? In this definition, who sets the standards for fair and just relations? Yep, and society is not going to collectively come together and say, let's construct a set of rules that say this is how we're going to live. Where does that come from? I'm going to use a quote from the author of that book, Why Social Justice is Not Biblical Justice. He quotes, "Unless justice is founded upon a transcendent, objective basis of righteousness, it necessarily will be founded on man-made morality imposed by whoever holds power." That is the Achilles heel of man-made justice. So many people have been fooled so many years, generations, centuries gone by, who have entered into a revolutionary context to throw off the bourgeois or throw off whatever imposing power that there is, only to be replaced by, guess what? Another power. And that's, yep, said it right there. Do we really need to go through this? Do we really need to review the lessons of the Third Reich, the Stalinism, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, and more? How many times does this happen throughout history? Only to have one set of power to be replaced by another set of power. The answer, of course, is this moral, this fairness and justice should be transcending mankind, does transcend mankind. It is God-made as opposed to man-made. This is what is at stake in the social justice movement. Biblical justice demands that all people, regardless of who they are and what station of life they fill, are subject to a moral law higher than themselves, as well as a supreme lawgiver. And again, people fighting for the social justice movement are blinded by the fact that invariably this type of movement leads to a form of elitism. Invariably, it will lead to elitism. I find marvel at the number of leaders in this movement who they themselves, in this age of identity politics, who they themselves are identified with a particular class and hold enormous wealth. It just befuddles me. But again, if you really pick it apart, there's just so many inconsistencies. Again, Scott David Allen. Just societies are built upon the truth that all human beings are God's image bearers, and as such have equal dignity, incalculable worth, and rights that cannot be taken away. That is biblical justice, and it transcends mankind. And it's interesting that mankind's justice so happens to conform to the ever-changing morals that takes place in society. God's justice does not change. People were made in the image of God 10,000 years ago. People today are made in the image of God. People 10,000 years ago were of incalculable worth and worthy of protection, worthy of dignity. Today, people are of incalculable worth, upholding dignity and protection. So the answer is no. Social justice is not the same as biblical justice. Did I just use a double negative? They're not the same. I think you got that. They're not the same. So next week, we're going to expand on this social justice study and specifically talk about those three areas that we brought up earlier. So that guides us through today.